Evening, everyone, and welcome to the Raymore City Council work session for Monday, October the 21st. We have several items on our agenda tonight, the first of which is our code review for Titles 6 and 7 of our city code. I'll turn it over to Mr. Cataret, who's returning to the room here.
Thank you, sir. This evening, staff is seeking feedback from the council regarding Titles 6 and 7 of the City Code. These are the last two titles that staff is presenting to council that come as a result of our comprehensive code review we've been working on for several months. So this evening, we did include in the packet additional changes that we would be requesting to make to Chapter 600 regarding the alcoholic beverages. What I'd like to do is have Mr. Zur just give a brief overview of those changes, specifically regarding the classifications for the licenses, and then staff does stand ready to answer any questions you'll have on either the alcoholic beverages, Title 6 or Title 7.
Thank you, Mr. Cataret. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. However, during the course of the final review, City Clerk Ms. Warner had identified some identification of not necessarily conflicting, but difficult to correspond between our code and state law, in particular the consumption of liquor license. So we had the opportunity to meet last week and go over some of those. If you'll look on page 11, that's principally where you're going to see what I would identify as a principal change from what you were originally provided, and that is the consumption of liquor license, which would be basically consumption on a particular property. Not necessarily where it is being sold. So, for example, think of it in terms of perhaps the racetrack out in Wyandotte County, where you're able to take alcohol in of your own choosing and then drink it at that location, but you're not necessarily purchasing it at that time either. So this is the building and hall rentals where I would identify the most critical change from what was previously provided to you. I'll look down the aisle and see if Ms. Werner has any other critical changes that she can think of that went with that discussion, but I think this was the major one that you'd want to look at from what was originally provided.
Mr. Zur is correct. This was the main change. What we did was incorporate our liquor classifications to mirror exactly state statute language and that provided by the Division of Alcohol and Tobacco. Not only our ease in identifying those applications, but for the applicants as well as they apply for the state, that our license mirrors that.
Just dovetailing off of that too, in discussions with the agents for the state of Missouri, the notion was we don't have to adopt all of their licensure requirements at this time. So we have identified those that we think are most applicable to what the businesses are in the city of Raymore right now. We did not adopt all of them. For example, distillers of large quantities of whiskey, bourbon, and otherwise might be identified in there, but we did not necessarily incorporate those licensures within the terms of what we've got here, simply based upon the fact that we don't anticipate that as a upfront economic option for us right now. But we can always add to those at a later time if in fact we are presented with an application for it.
Any questions? Mr. Holman.
So just so I have a pretty thorough understanding, if we adopt the changes as presented, an individual would not be able to have an event where they both sold liquor and you brought alcohol in. Is that correct?
Right. The one that you're looking for, the COL, the change that you're looking at on that one is just going to be an event where they are bringing alcohol to the location. Think of it as an event for a hall rental or something along those lines, where they are having a caterer come in order to actually serve it with alcohol that they have purchased separately, but is not being purchased from that facility.
That makes sense. And then I know at one time, maybe I'm a little bit dated, but we were way behind the times and still allowed drive-through liquor stores. Are we going to eliminate that with this new code change?
I don't believe we've got any reference within the terms of our code for a drive-through liquor store at this particular time or as proposed.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Jeannie, did you have something to add to that?
No, sir.
Okay. Anybody have any questions about Title VI? So just from my understanding is that, you know, oftentimes not-for-profit organizations as a fundraising event will hold that event, but they will get liquor donated in order not to have that expense from a wholesaler or somebody like that. What in our licenses would prevent that? Or was that exactly what you were talking about, where they would be able to bring in outside liquor, provide it during the event on premises, as long as there was a distributor with a license present?
It would be not a distributor itself, it would be with a caterer who would be able to come in order to be able to provide that. So
Okay.
it's the individuals. I don't know that I've got necessarily anything in there that's going to be distributor-oriented under the COL. And my view of it has always been this is a private organization, not-for-profit entity that comes in order to be able to throw an event. During the course of their event, they have previously purchased or they are serving alcohol that has been purchased by them through their caterer at that
As
particular
long as their
time.
caterer has the license?
That's correct.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Berenson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I know we were past the time of questions here. Something did kind of pop in my head here. So just for example, the Centerview building here, if we were to rent that to somebody for, let's say, a Super Bowl party on a Sunday, so we would not allow them to have alcohol on a Sunday just because it's a Sunday?
That would be, are you looking under that as beer by the, yes, that's correct. Under the COL, there is no Sunday licensure for the COL, that's correct. And that complies with state statute as well. In fact, that was one of the things that
Okay.
Ms. Werner and I had specifically called down to the ATC in order to find additional information because we were looking for that Sunday authorization. They do not have it either from the state
So
level.
it's the state that forces us not to allow that, is that correct?
The state does not have that as one of their allowances under the COL. And of course, we have to have ours be in compliance with state. So we have not included the COL under ours.
All right, thank you.
Anyone else before we move on to Title VII? Okay, you want to take on Title VII now, Jim?
There are no staff proposed changes to what we distributed to you a month ago with Title VII, so we're here to answer any questions if you have over any of the Title VII items.
Okay. Mr. Holman?
Back up, just one to clarify Councilmember Berenson's comment, would only apply to sale. So if you were going to have that Super Bowl party, you could have alcohol, but it's just, this is just governing sale of said items, is that correct?
I don't believe so, Councilmember. I think that you're looking at the, when you've got COL, it's specific to not being allowed on Sundays for that, so renting out the location. And Ms. Werner is trying to get my attention down at the end.
Go ahead, Jean.
The COL license is for an existing restaurant that doesn't hold a liquor license. So the consumption on the premise license would allow them to have people bring in alcohol and consume it on the premise. But for those restaurants, no. Your question is that, would they have Sunday sales? No. However, a caterer's permit in the event of an event at Centerview would have the opportunity to have a Sunday sale.
But that would be for sales, that would be for sales, not under the consumption on the premises where they are bringing it in separate for their own personal consumption.
That's correct. And according to the state, if there is no admittance charged, no exchange of money whatsoever, no prize, no wristband, et cetera, that is not applicable to any type of liquor license.
So they could consume it on premises, correct?
If there's no money
If it's a
exchange,
private
there's no
party?
license required.
Yeah.
Thinking we were missing something there, thank you.
Okay. Because I know under their permitting, which is what the Parks and Recs have established, is that if there's liquor on premises, there have to be police officers present at those.
That's correct, at those events, yes.
But the distribution of the liquor itself can be done without a licensee, correct? I mean, if I just brought in a cooler of beer for a party that we were having, I'd have to hire the cops, but I wouldn't necessarily have to have a license to distribute the liquor amongst my friends or whatever.
If there's no charge for alcohol that
Right.
you're distributing, no
Right.
charge for entry, admission, wristband, et cetera, you're correct. There's no
Okay.
license
All right.
required.
Just want to make sure. There you go. you suggesting a Super Bowl party?
You bring
I'm
the
sure we're going to
cooler,
be in this
I'll show
one
up.
now. Anything else on Title VI? And then I'll ask if there's any questions on Title VII. If not, I assume it'll show up on the agenda at the next council meeting?
Our next step will be, I don't know that it'll be on the next council agenda, but it'll be on an agenda soon, where we'll actually bring the entire document as an ordinance for your review.
Okay. Any questions on that before we move from code review? Seeing none, we'll move on to item B. I don't even want to say this, but the utilizing of live goats for a one-time brush clearing. Mr. Cataret, what necessitates this?
I will explain that to you, sir. So staff did receive a request from a resident to allow the use of goats to be brought onto the property to remove excess vegetation that this resident has in their fenced-in backyard area. The resident wants to hire Margaret Chamis. Margaret is the owner of a company called Storm Dancer Farm, which is an affiliate of an organization that goes under the business name of Goats on the Go. At their company, she lives in the Northland area. She has a herd of goats that she utilizes on a contractual basis to take care of vegetation issues, typically in areas where there might be overgrowth that is just hard to manage. Somebody doesn't want to use any pesticides, herbicides, and they want to use a more natural way of clearing the brush out, and so her firm does specialize in that activity. She reached out to me back in August asking if this business would be allowed in the city of Raymer. She was calling on behalf of the property owner. So my immediate reaction was, well, under the Unified Development Code, you can't have goats on anything other than acreage property, ARRE. So my response was no. She indicated that that's why she called. Some communities allow it, some communities do not allow it. And the next day, I did get a call from the property owner following up. The property owner I provided the same explanation that I did not believe under our city code it was allowed. He asked if there was any exceptions to the code, and with the Unified Development Code, there's no exceptions. I indicated it would require action by our council, a code amendment to allow this activity. In doing some research about the company, I looked into the communities that allow the use. She currently, or has in the past, provided the service to the park department of the City of Liberty. For example, they had an area in their park that needed some clearing out. So in those examples, and I think she also did work for Powell Gardens, where they had an area, a couple of acres they wanted cleared out. In those instances, she actually has temporary fencing that she brings in to surround the area that needs to be cleared out. It brings the goats in. Again, I think she has a small herd. I believe she has somewhere around 40 goats. Not that she brings all of them to the property, but brings them in, allows them to graze, and they take care of the overgrowth situation. Looking at, I know again that she indicated that Liberty was one of the communities that did allow it on residential properties. So we wanted to find out a little bit about the process that they utilized to allow that activity within their city. And knowing that Mr. Kapke of Willard and Kapke is a city attorney there, I asked Mr. Zer to talk with him to find out if there's any background how do they allow that activity to occur. I thought we would share that aspect of it with the council.
Thank you, Mr. Cataret. So I did have the opportunity to speak with Mr. Kapke regarding this. They have viewed this not necessarily as zoning issues, but more as a business licensure issue. So from our perspective, it's going to qualify under a landscape and landscape architecture and lawn mowing businesses that you would have conducted. I do not view this, and we did not view this as an animal husbandry or the maintaining and keeping of animals. We didn't view it as part of the zoning side of this world. We viewed it as as the owner is not exerting any dominion, control, or otherwise over these creatures. They are brought in by the company, they do their job, and then they turn around and take these animals out and move on. So did not view this as, from the perspective of a zoning violation, viewed it from the perspective of the operation of a business, just like a lawn mowing business would. Though I would note that the goat grazing that is being performed under this business is not bring them in and once a week let them mow your grass. This is once they are addressing large overgrown areas that are difficult perhaps to get to. In the city of Liberty, for example, they were using it in their parks portions where they had areas that may have had large amounts of poison ivy and things that they wanted to be able to, would have been difficult to get back into, and they wanted to make sure and just have it entirely removed. So that's kind of the analysis that we had provided as far as Liberty is concerned and as far as our code is concerned. I know Mr. Carteret had views this from the perspective of zoning concerns and zoning issues, which is exactly what his area of expertise is, but I viewed that as not necessarily in violation of zoning code provisions, but placing it under the world of business licensure.
If I can add just a little bit, if we were to handle it as a business license, that's the key right there, is that it can't be someone's cousin bringing in, a few goats to be able to take care of the backyard area. It has to be a legitimate licensed business with the proper insurance that we require for all of our businesses. And it needs to be somewhat of an in and out service. They come in for the day and they leave. As soon as you start having them overnight, you start getting into keeping of the animals on the property. The other thing that I want to show a little bit of caution on with this, if we go the business route, I don't believe we're limiting it to goats. We need to think there are other animals that do other activities that somebody could hire in to come onto a property to take care of a problem. Goats take care of the overgrowth, other animals take care of other issues that someone might have in their yard. So we just need to keep that in mind, that if we do say it's okay to do this as a business, that it would cover other types of animals that would be brought in. But again, the key there is not overnight, because then you get into the keeping of the animals. And we believe that if the council was desirous of having this to be allowed within our community, that would be the route that we would need to take.
Any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Probably no surprise that I would support this. If you've ever watched goats eat poison ivy, it's amazing. I've had goats, and I have some fence areas that I've temporarily fenced off, and I put the goats there, and they'll eat the noxious weed first before they'll eat anything else. And so here's one of the advantages and why a lot of people will use these. For one, when you're weed eating this stuff, it spreads it everywhere, it makes a mess. When goats eat it, when they pass the poison ivy or whatever they eat, whatever seeds they pass are inert. So they take care of the noxious weeds, the poison ivy, and whatever the overgrowth is. And then when they pass it, the seeds are then inert, and it keeps it from growing back. And they can access a lot of areas that are harder to get to with modern equipment as well, too. So it is a pretty common practice. They do airports and other cities. So I, for one, I do support it with the limitations in place that Mr. Carteret spoke about.
Mr. Burke?
Thank you. Do we have any provisions already in place for such as bees, like for agricultural purposes, same kind of thing? You bring in a group to do a job and then...
Our code is currently silent specifically regarding the keeping of bees. I mean, we have provisions in the general provisions in Animal Control Code that would, if we have a nuisance situation created, but in general, we are silent right now in that aspect in our code.
It seems like to me that would be a very similar type of situation where they're brought in to do a specific thing that honestly there aren't a lot of better ways to do it in some situations, and then they're gone. They've come in, just like if you hire people to come and roof your house, they do it and they leave. I don't see a lot of problem with that as long as it's not going on after business hours when people are trying to conduct family life.
Mr. Townsend?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You hit on a couple of points that I had some questions about regarding the husbandry of this and not being on the property overnight. But some questions I have is, Right now, I believe what I'm reading here is just for permitted on areas, keeping of animals, excuse me, an acre or RE districts only. But if we go down the business license track, then there is no zoning restrictions provided. As Mr. Zer said, they're not hiring the animals specifically to get their grass down to 4 inches, but it's
That is correct, yeah. The limits, the per acre limits is more for the actual keeping over a longer period of time, so we would not place that limit on the business license aspect of this.
so then my question becomes, if we follow the business license understanding, then someone can hire the goats or any other type of farm animal to do, to take care of insects. Those animals that tend to favor those are the goats that come in to take care of the vegetation. But someone can hire them on a daily basis for a week to bring them in and take them out. They're not overnight, but then we don't have any kind of gaming the system, if you will, to have animals in their yard, granted at an expense, but kind of skirting the code, if you will.
I think the notion here is what you're defining in the terms as keeping. And I want to continue to stress that notion is, from legal's perspective, you are identifying the keeping of it as an extended maintaining, feeding, well-being, providing for its care, as opposed to not being within the control at all of the individual who's on the property. I think the notion here would be, if this is going to be included as part of our licensure under business side, it's going to have language within it with regard to the hours of operation that would be allowed for it and the removal within the evening before it does become an issue for individuals within the community.
In your discussions with the Liberty entities, does their business licenses address this specific type of business, or it's just in general?
I believe they, as I recall from my conversation with Mr. Kapke, they have simply identified it as a generalized landscape lawn maintenance type of business operations. I'm not so sure you necessarily need to make it a specific business licensure in and of itself, but that would probably depend a little bit upon what kind of additional requirements we put on it for hours of operation and removal and things like that, which I'm sure Mr. Carteret would be happy to look into as part of the process.
That's what I was going to say. I can't imagine it being that effective just from an 8 to 5 perspective. It'd have to be like an overnight situation for 4 to 5 days or something to that effect. Well, they're not really keeping, they're kind of maintaining themselves to the consumption of the vegetation. That's why I didn't know that 8 to 5 thing would actually be an economical way for this to be allowed.
And Mr. Kapke actually did reference with regard to that and indicated that they can clear a large area relatively quickly depending upon the numbers of goats you're having in that area.
Okay.
When I did speak with Ms. Chambers, she indicated it was a one-day event that she's planning on. I don't know, we didn't talk numbers, but she indicated they would be in and out the same day.
Oh, okay. Circo.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, and most of what you said, they're going to places like the parks, the vast areas of overgrowth, things you can't get to. And are they asking, because I know we have already got the acreage, we got the A and RE, and then the R1 with acres. So are these people asking to come into within the city limits in small groups? I mean, is there that much overgrowth in some of the residential areas here that would have that problem? They need goats to come in and eat? Because from what I hear, it's very overgrown areas that they can't get to and treat, and that's why they want to hire these goats in. But I don't know if these people are asking to get within the city limits and regular standard properties.
The request is for a standard city lot. The one thing that this particular property that's asking is fenced in. So that is a requirement that the animals, of course, be contained. This person has a privacy fence around the backyard area. And there is overgrowth, there is brush, et cetera, that, but it's not a large area, but an area that is too much for the homeowner to take care of. So this was an alternative that they wanted somebody to come in to do clearing of the lower growth of the trees, bushes, and shrubbery and things that need to be that he wants control on the property.
Well, like you said something about they come in one day, they fence them, they take them out, they can't be overnight, then you run into a problem. where they're housing the animals. So are these people going to want to come in, they drop them off, they didn't finish, they pick them up, they bring them back the next day for another day to eat? I mean, they're going to transport them back and forth to this guy's property if they didn't eat it all up in one day, or?
It could occur. Again, my conversation with her in this example was, I got the impression the work would be done the same day.
I mean, they
But if
should.
not, they would be able to bring the animals back on another day to be able to complete the work if they needed to, just as any contractor would on a property until the work would be done.
I think that's the appropriate analysis, is it's being done by a contractor. So when you would allow for a contractor to be performing services on your property is when the hours of operation would be allowed here. Goats don't finish in a particular day. You obviously didn't bring enough goats to finish the job in the time frame allotted. You'll have to bring the goats back in order to finish the job the next day.
Well, then when you talked to Liberty, did they say they had residential they were using? From what you said, it looked more Parks and Rec and vast areas. It wasn't residential. They were actually dealing with this lady up north.
They do allow it on residential properties at Liberty. The example I gave, I know that it's being used in the park area at Liberty as well.
So my question on it is, of course, my first thought is, not having seen this particular property, is there really something else that they couldn't be doing? But going with, Mr. Kapke's statement about Liberty and so forth, about it being a business licensure, the examples given here are overgrowth, lots of foliage, can't reach it, so on and so forth. But if it becomes a business licensure, do you then have restrictions on where that can be used? Or to your point, if someone just decides they want to start using goats instead of a landscaping service, it sounds like under a business licensure that would be perfectly acceptable, would it not?
I think that would be the answer is probably so. But I think that would be a misallocation of the resource that you're talking about there. I don't believe that the goats are being utilized even under the Liberty scenarios for weekly mowing of one's grass. I think this is we are overgrown to the point where we are talking about code violations and we are correcting code violations.
Okay. Well, the reason I bring it up is, I'm not an alarmist thinking everybody's going to have goats in their front yard, but I do like to look at worst case scenarios. And if we're going to go with a business licensure versus a zoning situation, where zoning has very specific restrictions on what you can and can't do, not to bring up a negative situation, but with the recent discussion regarding chickens and that sort of thing, that got into zoning and that sort of thing. Now, I understand the chickens were going to be housed, so forth, overnight. I get that. They were going to be there for however long these people wanted them. The goats in this particular instance aren't. But it would be interesting, I guess, from my standpoint, before I moved on it, to at least see maybe Liberty's ordinance or somebody else's ordinance before I was really ready to move forward. I don't know that is this something that they're willing to do right away, or is this something that, is there some time here to review this rather than make a decision this evening?
I think the resident is wanting to do something this year, yes. They first approached staff back in August with the question. And then the intent at that point was to bring it forward to council, at least at work session discussion. But I think there is the need to have the work done yet this year. But it is something that we can certainly look at, not only Liberty, but a few other communities. We have a few other examples to see how they handle it. Because I think there are some perhaps restrictions we would need to place, such as making sure that when the animals are brought to the property, they are properly secured to the property, just as one example, and maybe the hours they could be there. Similar to a contractor is probably what we would do, but we could certainly draft that up, get that back in front of council, whether you'd want to see it back in a work session or whether you'd want to see it on an agenda for an action item, if you just give us the direction for that.
One more, kind of chiming off Mr. Jacobson. Right now, it's just a temporary deal. Basically, you're asking just to get started, whether it's a business license or a code. But you can't sit there and say that down the road that couldn't get a little out of hand. And people, if they wanted to hire them, if they wanted to, at that point, bring them in. Because when you're talking about heavy, or you're going to stipulate it's got to be all heavy brush, hard to get to type of foliage, or you have to stipulate exactly what it is, or bring it for yards, grass, or start breaking it down, because people down the road could come in and say, I like the idea, And they can just use it in their yard if they want. We couldn't say no to at that point because it's a business license and they're coming in to do it, but.
At least starting it out, I think we want to be more generalized in how we draft the requirements. I don't think we'd want to get down to specifics about, how much overgrowth or what type of overgrowth qualifies you to be able to hire a contractor to come in to do this work. I think we want to be very general to start. If we run into a situation, we can always respond to that. Don't know that we would. Again, we've only had one request for this. And I don't think it's a common practice or a typical practice. Most individuals in the urban environment are able to take care of their properties. There'll be the exception. This property may be one where there's limiting factors as to why the backyard area got overgrown and needs this activity. So I don't think it's going to be a prevalent activity like a lawn mowing company is within the community.
I know this has probably been going on for years for these people, a lot of properties. It's not something that just happened overnight. So it's been long-term doing, and no one's really chose this method, but now they've come forward and they want to use this method all of a sudden, and it's starting something they're beginning, like Liberty in a few places, bring it to us. Hey, you want to get in and try this, maybe change your codes or your deals. And once you open that door, you start opening that door for other things that could be excessive that we don't want, and then you got to then fight back because you've already changed whatever the code to permit, and then you're already there. So that's what I worry about sometimes.
Mr. Holman, did you have something?
Just what I believe to be a clarification on this. I know this is a very odd curveball scenario. We don't get this very often, but and I think John would probably speak to this. You're going to bring these things in to mow your yard. They're not a lawn boy. They're not going to be They're not going to be eating something like this. And if they do, you're not going to have any grass left. This is a scenario like we had with the complaint up there on the south end of Creekmore. Gentleman with got a fence row, got a lot of overgrown stuff, and he's got rocks and other items in there. The cleaning is going to require the vegetation removal as well as hard item removal. This is kind of a unique solution to that scenario. The goats go in and eat all the vegetation, then I can go in and move the hard stuff. They're going to take care of the stuff that you're going to have to work very hard at to get. Am I correct, Mr. Berenson? And that's probably where when you see people use these, they're going to use them one time in long periods. It's not like you're going to use them even every year necessarily. If you keep the undergrowth taken care of, this is probably a one-time solution for most people, would be my guess.
Yes, Ms. Abdul-Wahid.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I'll just add to that, I agree with Mr. Holman. My neighbor, for example, we have a stream behind our house, and when he moved in, it was very overgrown back by the stream, and every time he went back there to try to clear, he was basically out of commission for 2 weeks because of the poison ivy and poison oak back there. And if he would have had this to help him clear it out, because we want to leave the trees there, and we don't want to spray chemicals because it's going to wash into the stream. I think this is a great alternative. I think it's important that we don't be really super specific on it because we don't do that with other businesses. And just to point out, there are a lot of decisions we make that have a potential to get out of hand, and city staff's great about staying on top of that and letting us know and working out how to keep things under control if they start to turn that way. So I'm in favor of this. It seems like a good alternative. I don't think anyone will take advantage. We probably nobody will know if their neighbor has goats for a day or not, most of the time. So it seems to make sense to me. And I like the idea of doing it under the business license and separate from the keeping of animals.
They'll bring it in and take it out in 3 days.
Yeah, I think there was a news thing on the news not before last about the city of Kansas City using goats in a fairly vegetated area to clear an area out. So the city even put them to hire. So, all right, so the question is whether to bring it to a work session or to a regular meeting. Are you comfortable with Mr. Cataret putting information together for us to bring to another work session? Are you comfortable with debating it on the floor of a regular session? Mr. Holman.
I'm in general support of this, but there are at least 2 council members, I think, that would like to see a little bit more on this, perhaps the Liberty ordinance and a little bit more follow-up. So I think in fairness to them, as opposed to jumping right into it, I think it's a valid idea to let staff bring back a little bit more information at a work session and let us make a decision then, sir.
Everybody good with that? Okay.
Thank you, sir.
And then There's nothing more on that particular item. In the packet that was handed to you tonight, there is an application for the Arts Commission, and it's been recommended to me by Mr. Eke and the Arts Commission that Cole Young would be a great candidate for that, and so that will be on the agenda. The other two are reappointments, Mr. Ackland and Mr. Bowie to the Planning and Zoning Commission. And so those three will be on the next council meeting agenda. If you have any questions, call me. And with that, I think we have a reason to go into executive session for personnel matters, so I will entertain a motion.
Mr. Mayor,
Mr. Holman.
I move that we move into executive session to discuss personnel matters as authorized by the revised statute, State of Missouri, 610.021 subsection 3.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I will second.
Can I have a roll call?
Councilman Townsend.
Yes.
Councilman Jacobson.
Yes.
Councilman Circo.
Yes.
Councilman Barronson.
Yes.
Councilwoman Ipadaga.
Yes.
Councilman Burke.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, we are now adjourned to executive session. Okay, cool.